Hello everybody, Dennis here from Awakening in Health, and I'm speaking to some people from the local radio station in Queensland, Australia, but some other people will actually be looking at this on my Awakening in Health channel on BitChute or YouTube. And I've just attended a rally in Cairns in Queensland for a Freedom Day. And I've met some very, very interesting people. Now, one of those people who I actually happen to know is a man called Austin, who has been delivering very, very interesting information for a number of years. So we're going to go on probably what could be a quite fantastic journey, actually, of why the world looks like it does now. And I'd encourage anybody to listen to this to have a little bit of patience with the discussion, but also to check what we're talking about, what we're saying, because the information we're going to be talking about is very dramatic. It is very fantastic, but it's very, very necessary, I think, for people to know about. So welcome, Austin, to Awakening in Health.
Hi, Dennis. Thank you for having me.
So that accent, for a start, that's not what I'd call an Australian accent, and neither is mine. So if you just want to give us a little bit of context about yourself and why you've started this journey and why you're passionate about, I guess, giving information to people about what we're looking at.
Yeah, I moved over here in 2009 and tried kind of to find my place in Australian society and figure out, where I should become a productive member of society over here. So that's how I got started 14 years ago.
And just to give us a little bit more context, you also started your career in the military. So knowing about, I guess, rules and regulations for you means a lot more than what it might mean to the average person.
Yeah, so I started my career in the States after I got out of university. I started out as a firefighter and in the medical industry. Fire and medical over in the States are combined, paramedical, EMT, and firefighting and rescue. Then I wound up, after I did my civilian service there, I went into the U.S. military, the Marine Corps, which is the Special Forces branch of the U.S. military. While I served there, I got to know and understand a little bit more about military law and how it's different from civilian law, and they are two completely different worlds. But when I was serving overseas, I ran into an Australian woman, and we decided to get married, and that was my deciding factor to get out of the military life. I wanted to try and live a normal life again. Wound up moving to Australia in 2009, and when I moved here, I kind of wanted to know, how do I go about living my daily life, my normal life here in Australia, without getting myself in trouble. In America, I had learned our Constitution growing up. I had learned a lot about, local laws, state laws, federal laws, and then when I went in the military, of course, I was charged with upholding a lot of the military laws as I became a non-commissioned officer. And then when I came to Australia, of course, I wanted to figure out where do I fit in all this. And I knew that some of the laws would be different, but I guess it's kind of been born into me and raised into me going along through my education in life of, being a law-abiding person and, not causing harm to people and looking after each other, and service to my community as well. So that kind of got me interested in when I decided to move here. Where do I start?
Okay, so I mean, I'm looking at this stuff as well for the last few years, and if any people who've listened to what I do on my show know the kind of, I guess, the direction I take the conversation in. But I think it's very important that somebody like myself maybe takes the position of where a lot of people who haven't dipped their toe into this area are. So I really want to hit you with some of the tough questions around this, to be honest with you, Austin, because the direction we're essentially going down, one, it's kind of fairly tedious, but it doesn't have to be. The second is when people get their heads around some of the simple concepts of what we're talking about, it's actually very, very fascinating. But the third is people like yourself could be deemed as far right. We hear these terms getting thrown around. So how would you defend yourself if I am to say you're some sort of conspiracy theorist, some far right person who is looking into law to challenge the government?
Well, the first thing I might say is, far right, or maybe right so far. When you start labeling, when you go down on labeling that ideological path, then you're talking about a political spectrum, and it doesn't have to be that political. When laws are written, they are actually supposed to be written apolitically, which means they're neutral. They don't care what side of the leaning side you're on. They apply to everyone, supposed to be to everyone equally. When I let me back up. I suppose when we look at the Constitution, I want to see, okay, that Constitution was written for everyone in this land, and it's not just written for one side of the politics, and the other party is excluded. It's written for everyone.
I want to stop you there for a second. So you're talking about that Constitution. So everybody, I think, who might be listening to this, especially Australians, are aware of the American Constitution. So what are you talking about when that? Like, how does that Constitution apply to us?
So when I'm currently referring to that Constitution, maybe let's be specific, and let's talk about that Constitution in America. So that Constitution in America was written before the current political parties really took hold and took shape, and those laws are genuinely applicable to anyone across the whole political spectrum. So I learned about the Constitution and how it was formed, and then the Bill of Rights, which would be the first 10 amendments to that Constitution, and I learned about how amendments are made, and if you ever want to change that, and how it goes about, and how laws are formed, and what laws are legitimate laws that you must abide by, and the supremacy of those laws.
Okay, you're listening to Dennis and at Awakening in Health, and I'm talking to Austin in relation to laws and why they're important. And we're going to take a short break now, and we're going to come back and find out why the Constitution is actually important for anybody. Welcome back to Awakening in Health. You are listening to Dennis O'Connor, and I am talking with Austin, who I met at a freedom rally today. I actually happen to know Austin, who delivers some incredible discussions at what we call a common law group, and I want to get to the bottom a little bit of what common law is and why it's relevant. And we've started a conversation about the American Constitution because Austin happens to be from America, and it seems like we're leading towards the fact that that American Constitution is relevant to us. So I want to really find out why that is. Austin, how would you answer that?
Yeah, so in America, the Constitution, we've previously said, is the supreme law of the land, and all the other laws that fall under that are subservient to that. They can't be made into law if they're repugnant to the Constitution. And when I moved to Australia, I really wanted to find out, well, is it okay for me? Is it acceptable? To be honest with you, the real basic question I had was, is it okay if I drink a beer as I'm walking down the street? And as I asked around, I got a variety of answers from people. People would say, oh, well, yeah, just don't do it out, don't make a big scene about it, mate. Just put it in a little koozie thing or, whatever. And I was like, well, I don't want to break the law doing that, but is it okay? Is it legal? And they said, oh, well, it depends on where you're at. And I got a variety of answers. And then I was like, okay, well, I was thinking, what are the laws here? Because if I'm going to live here and make this my permanent home, I really don't want to be thrown in jail for something that I didn't know about, right? And so that's what really kind of got me inquisitive about this. And so I reverted back to what I learned in America, and I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to start with anything, let's talk about what's the big law, the big set of laws, and that would be the Constitution. And I said, and I started asking some around to some of my work coworkers and my family and here in Australia, and I said, does Australia, do we have a Constitution here? And to my surprise, actually, several Australians didn't know if we have a Constitution. And I was like, how do you not know? But other people that I asked said, yeah, we have a Constitution here. Australia has a Constitution. I said, okay, what's in it? And I couldn't get an answer. And for the most part, a lot of people would say, oh, you Americans and your Constitution. And I said, well, don't you think that's important to know what's in it? And so I started digging a little bit into that, and I found out that there is a constitution in Australia. In fact, later on in my digging, I found out there's 2 constitutions in Australia.
Hang on a second. So, not only, I mean, most people will be probably surprised that Australia actually has a constitution, but you're telling me that there's actually 2 constitutions. I'm going to ask you how that works in a second, but I'm going to just throw down the gauntlet here. Why should anybody listening to my show, even why should I be listening to you? What makes you special? What makes, and again, I know there's a fallacy underlying here, which is the appeal to authority fallacy. So, again, that blunt question, why should I listen to you?
Well, to be honest, I'm a normal guy. I'm not, I didn't study any political science, and it was just a personal quest for me to to understand, how do I fit in here without breaking the law, really, and I didn't want to cause any trouble when I first moved here, and so I thought, okay, well, let's go find out. And in America, that's how I would have found out, is starting at the top and say, this is the Constitution, and by the way, there's all these amendments to it. They're called the Bill of Rights. But over here, I know that the Bill of Rights doesn't exist, and I know that it doesn't provide any protections for people here, citizens or anything like that. And so I had I went digging, and I found out that there is a Constitution. And then I started looking at that Constitution, and I noticed on the front of it, the front page of it, that there's this seal that has a lion and a unicorn on it. And that I was like, well, hang on, that's the seal from the royal family over in England. And, oh, ding, yeah, hello. This is a Commonwealth nation. Australia is a Commonwealth nation. It falls under British authority. And of course, I'm an American, and we had rebelled, so we didn't carry that same seal in all of our legislation. And that was fought through a war. But I knew I knew a bit of history about Australia, and I knew that it was actually settled it was as a British penal colony. So prisoners were brought over from England, and they were put under guard by the British military here. And that's what pretty much started Australia as a Western nation. And so when I started looking into things, and I said, okay, well, that must be the symbol or the seal, if you will, that says that that's a lawful document. Okay, cool. I can go with that. But then I started looking around, and I was starting to dig a little bit more into other laws. And as my career progressed, I started getting into I started realizing Australia is a very regulated nation. There's a lot of laws about telling you how you must do this and do that. And I started looking at some of those laws because at workplace especially, I didn't want to break the law. And then I started looking at them, and I'm seeing some of these laws that have this kangaroo and the emu on them. And I thought, that's different. Why is that different? And that's really what kind of got me digging a little bit more.
Okay, so it can be a fairly tedious topic, so I'm just trying to, get the essentials out here. There's a few things I'm hearing. One, that all our current regulations, and I happen to fully agree with you, I think Australia is ridiculously over-regulated, and we saw that in Melbourne, lockdowns, all these kind of things that happened. What you're saying is there's an underpinning constitution that's sitting on, and the laws are sitting on top of that constitution, but we should always be referring back to that constitution, which actually sounds like it might be an okay document. But now what I seem to be picking up from you is that we had an original copy, and the rebranding or that change in the seal got you thinking that, hang on a second, there's been a change here, and maybe that change is not in our best interests compared to the original constitution. Am I right here? And if I, again, clarify if I'm not, but even more than that, then how does that relate to, why is, as opposed to this, I guess, oblique discussion, how is this affecting us now? What relevance? I want people who are listening to this, I want to understand why that's important.
Yep. So I've spent the last 14 years of my life living here in Australia, and plus years. And so I've done a lot of research, and I'll kind of bring us up to current, I guess. So understanding that the true laws in this country, and there's a process of how laws are actually made in this country, in Australia. And so the real process of how they're made is that we would, as citizens, now I'm not concluding myself here because I'm not a citizen, but Australians will elect people that they say that's their representative into the parliament, which is a form of a democratic government, representative government. You elect those people into the different houses of government. You have an upper house and a lower house. Now, when a law is made, one of those representatives might say, hey, I have an idea. I would like to create a law. And in order to do that, they need to write it out on paper, and they create what they call a bill. Okay, and it's a draft version, and then they bounce that off of their colleagues that work in the same house with them, so lower house, let's say, for example. As that goes around, they make some revisions, and then they say, okay, we agree on this. Let's send it over to the upper house or the other house, and let's see if they agree with it. And so then they have their discussion on it. They make any kind of revisions, and when the two houses finally come together in agreement there, then they have to send, that's not a law yet. At that point, it's a bill. But in order to get that bill turned into a law, it has to be approved. And here's the interesting part. In the nations that we live in, including Australia, that approval actually comes from God. So whether you like that or not, whether you believe in a Christian God or a Buddhist God or any God for that matter, the way laws are made in this country is that it needs to be approved, seek approval from God. Now, obviously, we can't take a piece of paper and say, God, do you approve this law for us to live in this land? So what we do is the Archbishop of Canterbury has delegated himself as God's direct representative. Okay? And then, obviously, the Archbishop can't be in all nations and everywhere at once, so he takes that authority from God and delegate some of that authority off to other people, and that's where we have that authority delegated to the crown. So in England, that would be the royal family, the Crown of England. And so then the Queen has the authority to say, I approve that as a law in this land, in that land there, and say in Australia. Now the Queen, obviously, she has many countries that she was looking over, and we're talking back in those days, that would have been Queen Victoria II. And so she obviously can't be in all places at one time. So she would then take her authority and pass that along to, in this country, it would be, who?
Governor General.
The Governor General, that's correct. So then that Governor General is the Queen's representative here in this country. So these two houses have a bill, and they want to have authority to say, yes, it's now a law. And that actually requires what we call royal assent. And so for the Governor General to pass it into law, they need to be able to stamp it with the seal of the royal family, which would be the lion and the unicorn. And that's what happened with our initial constitution here, and it's called the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act 1901 and UK, because it was a UK act and it turned into a law, right? And so that's where I found my original constitution that I was seeking here in Australia. And I said, oh, well, there's a lion and a unicorn. That makes sense. It's from the royal family. It's been approved. But you see, that all changed later on, and I started seeing some of these more recent laws, and they didn't have that royal seal on them. And I said, okay, why is that? So,
okay, I'm going to try and make a little bit of sense of this, because it's a tough subject for people to understand. So I gather what you're suggesting is that in around the time of, let's say, the American Constitution, the Bible was incredibly important. God was incredibly important. Every country has, I guess, a deity. So our laws, in essence, are seen to come from that spiritual place, that God place. And I guess this is why we would swear in the Bible when we get into court. So whether there is a God that's controlling stuff, or whether we're agnostic, or whether we're actually atheistic, it doesn't really matter. I think what you're suggesting is that the structure is built upon the premise that there is an omnipotent and a benevolent kind of presence that tries to do good. And then we have a constitution which tries to reflect what might be good for humanity. And then off the back of that constitution, we should have laws that work for us. And you're saying that the original constitution had the kind of, the correct lineage behind it, of that stamp with the royal family. And then you've just discovered that the more recent constitution actually has almost, I think you're saying, a fraudulent stamp, which could invalidate all our legislation and laws recently. Am I hitting that in any way?
So it's interesting you've deduced that already, but yes, that's in essence that's what I'm saying. What I've come to learn over the course of my research is that in the 70s we've come to a point where the Whitlam government has pretty much hoodwinked the Australian public and created a corporation that is acting as the government, and they've replaced that royal seal with the kangaroo and the emu, and that's the corporate logo. So I know that's going to be a little bit confusing for some people, so I guess let me clarify a little bit. Maybe say there is a corporation called Commonwealth of Australia. There is a corporation called Australia. There's many corporations, and we can in fact prove this, they are registered as corporate entities on the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and they're publicly trading companies.
Okay, so we're getting kind of fairly profound now. First of all, you're telling me that every recent law since 1975 or so is a fraudulent law because it has got an incorrect stamp on it. Okay, which has massive implications, obviously. Secondly, you're telling me that I'm not living in a country almost, but I'm living in a business structure. You're telling me that that Australia is essentially a company. Am I missing anything here?
Well, so far you're up to speed. Yes, that's correct. And so what we have to realize then is, okay, if that's a corporation that is operating as the government here, then really what kind of laws are we supposed to follow? Because if they've removed the crown seal, and we know that that's how laws are supposed to be made here, if they've removed that and they don't put that on any other current laws that they're passing, then are they actual true laws, or are they company policies?
And when we take it down this path, some things start dropping for me. That some of the regulations that we are getting exposed to are about making money for a company, as opposed to about having any form of justice or form of, I guess, a rightness or a wrongness in a biblical sense. So it's quite profound when I'm kind of mulling over the enormity of what you're saying. But here's the thing. So if it were so simple, and it sounds kind of simple, how come more people don't know about this? How come we can't use this to say to government, for example, when they are instituting unfair or wrong policies? And by wrong, I mean, the opposite to what's morally good. If it were so, I guess, blatantly obvious, how can we use this?
Well, a couple things there. So, number one, it's not necessarily blatantly obvious to most Australians because, as I mentioned earlier, you ask around to Australians and you ask them about a constitution if one exists, and I shouldn't say most, but quite a fair bit of Australians don't even know a constitution exists in Australia. Most Australians don't even know what's in the Constitution, and that's a very accurate statement. So if you don't know what's in it, then how do you know you've been hoodwinked, right? How do you know that someone's pulled the wool over your eyes and they're actually masquerading as a government and they're really a company? So I guess maybe it takes an outside person, maybe it takes an outside foreigner's eye, an inquisitive eye, to ask some of these questions and to kind of pique the curiosity and start asking, say, well, hang on. That's government, but that's not. Now, when we start talking about the policies that they're making, and if it's a corporation, you can compare that corporation, Australia, to another corporation in this country. So call it Woolworths or Coles or Mecca's or whatever corporation that Subway. It doesn't really matter. That corporation has its own company rules, and if you're an employee of that corporation, you need to follow those rules. If you want to contract with that corporation, you need to also abide by the contract, which usually is in alignment with their rules. So when we look at these acts that have been passed without the royal seal and the royal assent on them, you have to understand and recognize that is a corporate policy. And there's no royal assent to it, which means it's not law. And so we're talking about a different kind of law here. So it's not necessarily lawful. It might be legal because a contract has been written or agreed to, but there is a difference between lawful and legal.
And I think what you're talking about here is the concept of bylaws. And just because it's a bylaw doesn't mean to say it's an intrinsic, almost God-ordered law, which really throws a lot of things into the can of worms. It opens a can of worms, should I say. Okay, why is this important? And I'm kind of steering the conversation a little bit towards something that I know you're familiar about, which is called Black's Law Dictionary. And the deception, I guess, that's been put in front of people. I'd love you to talk a little bit about that.
So you've brought up Black's Law Dictionary. There's actually, it's not just Black's Law Dictionary. There's an Oxford Law Dictionary. There's a couple of law dictionaries. But when you and I are speaking in what we call English, common layman's English, we're speaking in a different version of English than what is the legal version of that language. And so when we look at the courts and the government and these different organizations and how they operate, they're operating under a different version of the English language. And that is deeply rooted in the Latin language, believe it or not. So the words that they use come from a Latin origin. And it's funny that we don't teach Latin in the schools anymore. And it's funny that we don't teach the Constitution in Australian schools. I've spoken to many people from early 70s. They since then, they haven't learned that.
Why is that?
Well, if you keep someone stupid, they're easy to control. Right? And I'm not taking a dig at any Australians here at all, but, unfortunately, you've been kept stupid.
You're saying ignorant more than stupid, because there's a lot of clever Australian people, but ignorance, and ignorance is not meant to be derogatory. It's okay. Basically a non-awareness of some facts, I'm guessing.
Fair enough. Ignorant. I guess ignorance is when you're not aware. Stupidity is when you are aware and you go along with it anyway. So, yes. By design, all of the people here are being kept ignorant of the truth. They're being kept ignorant in the language that is spoken in the courtrooms and in law that's being made. You don't understand Latin, you don't understand the roots of the meanings of these words, and you think that you're speaking English, but you're not speaking the same English that they are.
So slow down there, cowboy. How is this give us some examples here. I mean, that just sounds preposterous, that you're saying that I can be in a court in front of a magistrate, in front of judges and the prosecution or whoever, and I'm hearing English, but it's a foreign language. Is that what you're trying to say? I need some examples of this. You need to be telling some of the listeners here about what you mean.
All right, so I'll give you two examples. The first one, we'll talk about the word mandate, and the second one, we'll talk about the word corporation. So mandate, when we hear that word, that's been used a lot over the past few years. We know all about the mandates that came down with COVID. Lockdown mandates, mask mandates, jab mandates, all of it. The word mandate, when a normal person hears that word, they think, I must do this because they're telling me you have to. It's a mandatory thing. You have to do that. And when you look in a law dictionary, though, there's in the Black's Law Dictionary, for example, there are 4 different definitions for the word mandate. The first 3 definitions relate to superior courts issuing orders to lower courts, and they must follow those directions. But when it comes to people like you and I, the 4th definition in the Black's Law Dictionary tells us that a mandate is an offer to contract. It's a gratuitous offer to contract, which means if you agree to those terms, you're not going to get compensated for it. We're not going to pay you for it. We're not going to give you any benefits for it. But so the mandator would, in the case of all those mandates that we had with COVID, that would have been the government. The mandator offers a contract to us as the mandatee. And that contract is gratuitous. They're not going to reimburse us. They're not going to give us any money for it. But it only becomes valid when you agree to it.
Okay, so what you're saying is the mandates were actually a contractual offer, and we have a right to refuse. So then how come we couldn't refuse, or how come people couldn't refuse with these mandates? How come they were locked up, they were put in jail? And actually, before you tackle that question, you said the other word, corporation. Explain that first and then follow up.
Yeah. Right. So let's talk about the word corporation. So we'll stay on track here. Corporation. We commonly, in what we think is English, we would say a corporation. Well, that's a company at a certain level of registration. That a business becomes a corporation, and there's a lot of technicalities we can dive into with that. But when you break it down into the Latin language, it's broken into two words: corp and oration. And corp meaning corpus or the dead. And oration means to speak. So when you talk about a corporation, that is speaking, it's a dead language. This is the dead speaking. And so when you think about, how does that translate into what we know today? Well, a corporation is actually not a live entity. It's not a living man. It's not a living woman. It's a dead entity. And so when they conduct business, that corporation is speaking in a dead language. It's the dead speaking. And so if we can kind of understand that that's just by way of example, but there's a lot of trickery in the language that they're using with us.
So, and this almost comes back to, I guess, that biblical context of speaking with the dead. It almost sounds like there's a spiritual or an occult feeling behind what you're saying. I want to leave that for a second, but I want to then go back to my other question, which was how, I guess, this is being used against us, and why aren't people aware of this, or how can we use this to benefit ourselves, I guess?
Yeah, so let's go back to that word mandate again, right? And we heard plenty of times from the government on TV and on the news that there's these mandates that are in place. And they told that to all the business owners around in the whole entire country. They told it to us as individuals. And they said, look, these are the mandates. You must do the, mandate this. And so by our not understanding what that means, we just said, okay. And a lot of us just obeyed and did it. And that obeying, that agreement to that contract, that offer of contract that they gave to us, locked us into a contract. You are now bound by that mandate, which is the offer of contract. You didn't have to. There were many people who didn't mask up. And so if you wanted to take a pass on that contract, you could do that.
So really, we've been educated with our understanding of words to comply because we actually don't know the real meaning of the words that are actually spelled out in dictionaries like Black's Law's dictionary, and because of that we're almost under a spell of compliance. And if enough people had been aware of that, then we may not have had the outrageous things that were happening in Australia. Is that a fair way of framing that?
Yeah, that's a fair way of framing that. And another one that we keep throwing around here is the word understand. To understand means you're standing under the authority of that person. So, for example, by way of example, if you ever have an interaction with the police here, who are the policy enforcers of the corporation, government, they will talk to you, and at the end of whatever they're trying to tell you, they'll say, "Do you understand?" And if you agree and you say, well, you commonly think, well, that means, yeah, I comprehend what you're saying. If you say, yes, I understand, well, what you've done through trickery of language is you've said, I stand under your authority. And so anything that they've told you, you now stand under that. You have basically given consent to whatever they have told you and that they're going to tell you. You stand under their authority.
Very interesting stuff. We're going to take another little break here, and we are going to dig a little bit deeper into this. I'm talking with Austin, who is a student of common law, and we're listening to this possibly on Cairns Local Radio and a few other platforms, and we shall be back very soon. Welcome back to Awakening in Health, and you are listening to Dennis O'Connor, and I'm talking with Austin, who is educating people about common law and why it's important. And we're going to do a little bit of a synopsis of the conversation so far. is that Australia has a constitution. Not only that, it's got two constitutions. And it seems to be that the second constitution has an element of fraud about it. And not only that, but the legal system is speaking a language that looks and sounds like English, but it's not. And if we refer to something called Black's Law Dictionary, we understand, and again, Austin's explained about the word understand, there's different meanings to the words that we think are in plain English. So this is very, very profound information, and there's a lot of people doing very diligent work in discovering this and understanding this or comprehending this information. For the majority of people, they're not going to end up in court, maybe. Actually, there's even a caveat to that if we see what happened with people who were good people in Melbourne, for example, during the last 3 years. But is there a bigger picture here, Austin? Why again, is it important for people like me, people like you, to be aware of this, I guess, hidden language? It almost sounds like that typical conspiracy theory type stuff. What's going on? Why are you passionate in giving us this information?
Yeah, so you've mentioned that majority of people, normal people, won't end up in court. And, I'm going to challenge you a little bit here, Dennis. And now I'm going to ask you, outside of Australia, look around. What's going on around the world right now? You look over in America, and in my country, and I keep in touch with what the current events are over there, but January 6th, the people who were outside of the Capitol building, or some of them that went in, are now sitting in prison and for taking a tour through the White House. You've got the current...
Hang on. So the tour through the White House. This when I'm looking at CNN, NBC, all these channels, was I've heard it compared to 9/11. So, and I've heard the same kind of discussion on Australian media. Can you just expand on that slightly?
Yes. So, first thing I'm going to tell you is turn off your news, turn off your TV, because what you're being told there is a controlled message. You have to think about this. Who do you listen to? The media corporations in Australia. I don't care if you're listening to 9 News or 7 or 10 or whatever network you're listening to, even Sky News, it doesn't matter. Who are they owned by?
Whoa, okay, so people in general will find it hard to believe that, I don't know, Rupert Murdoch or Kerry Packer or whoever owns these corporations has an agenda against us. So obviously they're, to most people's thinking, are controlling the narrative. Are you suggesting that they're controlling the narrative?
I'm not only suggesting that they are controlling the narrative, but I'm suggesting that who pays them? Who pays them? Your advertising companies. And who are they? And I'm not talking about companies like Bunnings and companies like, I don't know, any of these, the Chemist Warehouse in Australia. Who are the major industries that pay those news organizations? And these news organizations, they're not only Australian owned. Rupert Murdoch, how many news organizations does he own around the world? Right? All of our news organizations, the mainstream media around the world, are owned by a handful of people. And if you think for 1 minute that those news organizations are going to say something bad about the companies that are paying them, then you're mistaken. You think about what companies are paying them. Well, let's talk about it. Let's ask that question. Big pharmaceutical companies, number 1. Number 2, big food companies, big petro companies. These are companies, these are not just companies, these are industries far beyond the scope of Bunnings, Chemist Warehouse, any of these other small, piddly, they're not small, but in this grand scheme of things, if you're taking money from big pharmaceutical companies, are you going to allow your network to then turn around and talk bad about them?
So essentially, you are saying that the networks are owned by these organizations, especially the pharmaceutical companies. Is that what you're saying?
Right, I'm going to tell you right now, those networks are beholden to what those pharmaceutical companies want them to say. And not only the media companies, but the government. The government takes money from them as well. Right, so let's talk about one of the main issues that we've had to deal with over the last 6 years. Okay, COVID. Pretty easy, right? You have most everyone in Australia, I'll venture to guess, most everyone in Australia has some sort of idea and inkling in the back of their mind that didn't go down the way it should have. There was something that was wrong there. Why are they telling us that they've got this disease that was having people drop dead in the streets of China, and that they were welding people into their homes? That's what we saw on the media. They were welding people into their homes in China as people were literally dropping dead in the center of the streets in China. They put that on the news. And they said, this is coming to your country. And so our governments, in lockstep, played a role in rolling out what they called control measures. You're going to wear a mask. We're going to lock you down into your homes. Then later on, it turned into, we have the cure. In record time, we have the cure. We're going to inject you with this, they call it a vaccine. Right? Who came up with the vaccines? Who's paying for all of that advertising? Who's paying? Did we ever see people dropping dead in the streets of Australia? Ever? Did we ever see people have to be welded into their homes? Ever?
So what you're saying is when they're talking about control mechanisms, it's not about controlling the virus, it's about controlling us.
Absolutely. It's always been about controlling us. And they've been doing it through many methods. I mean, we don't teach the Constitution. We don't teach the laws. If you're ignorant, we talked about that, you're easy to control. And then you turn around and you instill fear in people. And you show these images on TV. And they're not real. We know they're not real now. We've lived through that era. We've lived through COVID. We never once had people dropping dead in the middle of the streets. And now, I'll tell you what, if we did, I want to thank all of the public servants out there who came up at nighttime and cleared all the dead bodies from the streets for us so we didn't have to see them in the day. That's a joke. All of it is. So when you look at what's going on with government and media at the same time, they're working hand in glove to make us subservient to their control. And they're also using the trickery of language. And then when we want to fight back with it, they're using a different language so that we are unaware of how to legitimately fight them back.
I really like how you tied that back into, if we don't understand the root of where a lot of these laws, legalities, legislations are coming from, we have no hope. But when we start to, start digging and look historically about how things have been created, we can have a little bit of an edge about some of the controls again that are being forced upon us. And I really liked what you did there, Austin. You've if you were just to get straight to the point there, I can see how people would think that you are a classical conspiracy theorist. But I think what you've managed to do is really put together a very solid case for us to be at least incredibly suspicious of what's going on a local scale, but how that's being maneuvered and manipulated on an international scale. And I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I'm almost hearing you say that there are moves afoot that cross borders that essentially are putting us in a very dangerous and precarious situation.
Yeah, that's right. So, look, this dabbles in a lot of different areas, and you can take it down several different paths. But when you look at what is giving these different entities the power that they have, the corporation that's acting as a government here in Australia, the media companies, and to be able to perpetuate all the lies that they've actually been telling us. And we're finding out now that those are lies. What's given them that ability to do that? And it's finance. It's money. And then you look at, okay, well, where's the money coming from? Well, it's coming from our central banking system. And then you have to ask the question, well, okay, the central banking system is the government, right? Wrong. The central banks around the world are not owned by those governments. The U.S. Federal Reserve, let's talk about that real quick, because the U.S. dollar is where almost all the other world's currencies are based against the U.S. dollar. The Federal Reserve is a separate private entity from the United States Treasury. When the United States Treasury needs to have more money in circulation, they have to go to the Federal Reserve to ask them to print more for us. They borrow that money from the Federal Reserve. And then they have to prepay it back with interest. And that interest comes, and all of that payback comes from taxes and from Americans.
Okay, so the government and the Federal Reserve in America are totally separate. So what you I hear you saying is that we have a massive private business that gives money to the government with interest and then goes, thank you very much, I'm going to take all that money back and I'm going to add my cut onto it. There's no altruism here, is there? This is just a cynical grab to take our energy and our money. Am I missing anything there?
No, that's correct. But, I've given you the example of the U.S. Federal Reserve, and it applies to all the Federal Reserves. The Reserve Bank of Australia is the exact same thing. It is not run by the Australian government. And so when you look at where does our money come from, how do you think that the interest rates on your home mortgage are able to be increased by the government telling us that this is what they are set at? It's actually not the government, it's the Federal Reserve. They always tell you it's going back to the Federal Reserve has increased rates. And then that interest rate is passed on to the government who's borrowing their money from the Federal Reserve. The government then passes on that down through all the banking system, and it trickles down to you and me. Okay? And it puts us into a place, it's a system of usury, which is basically a version of financial slavery. You take a loan out, it's got this interest rate on it. You'll never be able to pay that back in the amount of time. You won't. You look at a mortgage and you take out a 30-year mortgage. At the rate that you pay it back, if you pay the basic payments on it, you're not going to be able to pay it back in 30 years. And the interest rates are able to adjust and change. And that's not because of the elected government that we think that we put in place. Because they're not a government, they're a company. It's because that company, the Commonwealth of Australia, is actually bound to a contract that they have with the Federal Reserve.
Okay, I think I'm understanding the point you're trying to make. You're telling me that it's not this futile investigation, but you need to look historically into some of the foundations of what's happened to understand why we have got to this place. And I think also what you're saying is that it's no accident we see ourselves where we are. It almost seems like you're saying that this was a very planned and deliberate journey in order to make corporations richer off the back of people like you and me, who essentially are slaves to the system, and it's been deliberately created that way. And then when we look at the structure of language, the English language based on Latin, we realize that even the language itself has been used to brainwash us into this acceptance of this trap, I guess, we see ourselves created in. And it seems as well that you're saying that this is not just a kind of a far-off picture that's oblique to us. I seem to sense urgency in what you're saying, and that we're seeing different countries around the world who are being dramatically affected by this in very adverse ways, and maybe you're saying that, I don't know, we've got to be looking at this stuff, getting onto it, and wake the hell up fast.
Yeah. So really, if you look at the system and what I'm telling you, you can research it for yourself. We can teach you. We can teach you. We do teach that. All of this stuff. We teach you where to go to find the information and document it. It's all publicly available. But if you think that the system is in a desperate situation, and we are facing desperation right now as individuals, and how do you fight back against it, right? The first thing you need to do is understand that there is this system in place. There is this other language in place. There is this, and where do you fit into that system? What's your role? What role do you play when you go in and you speak to a magistrate in a courtroom? What role do you play when you talk about having your rights, your sovereign rights? If you don't know the system, then you can't fight back against it. If you don't know your role in the system, then you can't play that game, I guess, if you want to call it that. And so what we're doing right now with the Common Law Assembly, and here, to be honest with you, I'll be completely honest, we're not the only ones teaching this. Our Common Law Assembly teaches it. We teach a variety of topics. But throughout the last, probably, I'd say 6 years, there's been what a lot of people are calling the Great Awakening, where people around the world are now understanding and exposing all of this corruption in their own countries. This is not just Australia. This is not just America, United States of America. We're coming to find out that this actually is happening in almost all countries around the world. And the people are genuinely figuring out ways that they can fight back against that corruption. They want their rights. They want their rights. They want to be able to live peacefully with each other. You know, that these corporations, they want to sow divisiveness into us. They want to throw terms around like racism and gender associations. That's throwing divisiveness into us. They create these endless wars where they're making money and we're killing ourselves. Right? They're keeping us suppressed. They're keeping us distracted from how we can really fight back. And what we need to do is see past that. See that? That's the whole thing about the voice in Australia. They think that they're going to give Indigenous Australians a voice in Parliament. Are you kidding me? The Indigenous Australians, this is their land, right? They should be giving the Westminster government a right to rule in this land. What they've done is they've flipped that. And they want us as, well, I should say Australians, to turn around and say, well, we'll give you guys back the right to have a voice in our parliament. That's completely backwards from where it should be. So that they're using all of these different distractions to keep us suppressed, and to keep the fight down at a lull.
Okay, that's all mind-blowing stuff. And even when I hear, you know, I happen to know a fair bit about this, but I think it's important to play that devil's advocate role, because I know some people out there are not as familiar with this stuff. If you had to sum it up in about 10 seconds or so, Austin, what's the purpose of this chat? Why are you here? Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are we talking?
Well, right now, the world is in a war, and traditional war these days doesn't exist. It's not guns and bombs. It's actual intelligence and information, and whether you like to admit it or not, that's why we have all this differences of opinions and people fighting against each other. And there are good versus evil forces fighting in this war. A lot of people are now coming to recognize that some of the organizations in this world are evil, and they have evil agendas, truly, and they're trying to figure out how to fight back. And I guess our mission, our goal, is to try and teach people about the ins and outs, the nuances, and about how the system is set up in the first place. And like I said before, you can't fight back unless you know how the system is already set up. And then you have a choice to either fit yourself into that system and tweak it so that you're in a different role, or step outside of that system, or create a new system and leave that other one in the dirt. Leave it in the past. Let it go.
Austin, I applaud your diligence and your passion, and I guess taking that forefront of finding out about a lot of this stuff and shortcutting people to getting some of this information. I love what you said. The information's out there, and you're not saying, listen to me, you're saying, look at this information yourself. Tell me whether I'm right or wrong. If anybody has any questions, there is a common law assembly in Cairns. If you want details of that, send me an email, dennis@awakeninginhealth.com, DENNIS@awakeninginhealth.com. And I hope you enjoyed this. It's such a vast, deep conversation that I think that we could easily have another discussion about this and take this in some other profound directions. So thank you so much for listening to Awakening in Health. Austin, thank you so much again for your time and for what I believe you're doing for humanity.
Wow. Cool, man. So that could go for like 4 more